Hello, this is Dwight Mutonono, also known as Mnyaradzi and also known as Mutos, and welcome to the Connection Desk. We are continuing with our series on the book of Acts, and we're now into Acts chapter 14 from verses 8 through to 20, and we are now into the area, the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe. So today we'll be looking at the city of Lystra, where they go to after they are in Iconium. Remember, when they went into that area, the area of Galatia, they started off with Poseidon Antioch. At Poseidon Antioch, they had to leave, or they were chased out of that place. They were expelled from the area. And then we get to Iconium, which is something like maybe about 100 miles away from Poseidon Antioch. And they go to Iconium, and in Iconium they spent a considerable amount of time. It seems it's a few months that they were there in Iconium. Some people come in from, follow them from Antioch, Poseidon Antioch. They follow them and raise up, they poison the group against them. And, there was a plot to now stone the two. And they made a decision to move over to these Lycaonian cities. They speak the Lycaonian language, and these two cities were called Lystra and Derbe. So let's read Acts 14 verse 8 to 20, and then I'll talk a little bit more about it. So in Lystra, there sat a man crippled in his feet, who was lame from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed, and called out, "Stand up on your feet." And at that, the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw that what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates, because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Men, why are you doing this? We too are only men, human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made heaven and earth and sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way. Yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they are difficult keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe. Okay. So we get to an area which seems not to have had a synagogue, and they are speaking to a gathering. I'm not sure how they got this gathering together, but they were speaking And as they were speaking, Paul saw this man who was crippled. And there are some similarities between the way that Paul, between the miracle here in which this crippled person from birth stood up and walked, to what happened in Acts chapter 3, where we see Peter and John doing the same thing with another person who was crippled from birth, a Jewish person who was crippled from birth. Some of the similarities that have been noted is that it's the first narrated healing in their ministry. Both Peter and Paul, this is the first narrated healing that you have. And they're healing a person who is disabled from birth. The Lord heals this person disabled from birth through them. They both looked intently at this person. Then they both saw that the person had faith to be healed. And they gave a command to stand and walk. Both of them did the same thing. And then we see the result. The person who was born lame from birth, crippled from birth, jumps up and leaps and walks. And then they were near some gates, either city gates or the temple gates. And the last thing that is similar in both stories is that they rejected human adulation, human worship that would have come through it. Because with Peter, he says, why are you surprised? This is what the Lord Jesus Christ was doing when he was on the earth. And in the instance of Paul and Barnabas, they say, no, we are not gods that have come from, into your city. So the people thought Paul and Barnabas were gods that had come. So we are now really into Gentile territory, and we are now meeting the gods of the Gentiles. It's Zeus, who is the king of the Greek gods. They say Barnabas is Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, and then they say Paul is Hermes, who is the messenger of the gods, the god of orators. It's because it was him who was speaking rather than Barnabas, who was the chief, spokesperson. So Barnabas seems to have been, as I said previously, he seems to have been the older man and maybe the more respected senior person amongst the two, because even though he was not leading, we're now talking about Paul and Barnabas, but when the group saw them, they gave Barnabas the more senior god, if you want. They made him the more senior god. He was the Zeus amongst them, and then of course Hermes was the messenger, Zeus's messenger. But Zeus and Hermes were often paired together. They were paired deities in that region at that time. They shouted in Lycaonian, "The gods have come to us in human form." Both Paul and Barnabas seem not to have understood what they were saying, because they were speaking in this language of Lycaonia. It seems that originally they were communicating, either they were communicating in Greek or they had a translator who was helping them. But whichever way, they didn't hear or they didn't understand what the crowd was saying. And it's only when the priest of Zeus comes and he's down to sacrifice to them, and he's got these bulls, bulls, it's a big sacrifice. He's come with these bulls and he wants to sacrifice to Zeus and Hermes, that they realized, no, this is what's going on here. And this community was a more rural community, more rural than Poseidon, Antioch, and Iconium, and there seems not to have been a synagogue or Jewish presence. And if you listen to Paul's sermon, there's no connection, there's no Jewish or connection to the message. When he's talking to Jewish people, he talks about the Old Testament and how it is that Jesus is the Messiah who is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. Because, in Jewish understanding, the Jewish people were the people of God. You see, amongst all nations at Babel, God chose to work through the nation of Israel. So you have the story from Abraham going downwards. You have the nation, the one nation that God chooses to work through is the nation of Israel. And the starting point when they're talking to a Jewish audience is always, the Old Testament background. They give you almost an exegesis of the Old Testament. Exegesis means they draw out, they give you an understanding of an Old Testament, and then they explain how Jesus fits into the story. But in this instance, Paul begins to talk to them, but his sermon does not mention the Old Testament story or even Jesus as Messiah, but goes right back to creation. And it goes back to the one true God who created heaven and earth. So the argument that Paul then makes is that there is one God who created heaven and earth. And he says, turn away from these worthless things to the living God who made heaven and earth. So there are these worthless gods of the nations. The gods of the nations are worthless. They are not gods at all. The one true living God is the God who created heaven and earth. And biblically, what is happening is, while God originally chose to work with the nation of Israel, once we get into the New Testament space, God says, okay, now I am going back to all the nations. So the message is to go to all nations. And all nations does not necessarily mean that you have to go through the Jewish people, but he talks about how it is that God who created did not leave himself without testimony, even amongst them as the people, the Lycaonian people. He did not leave himself without testimony, even though they were worshipping Zeus and Hermes and all these other gods who are worthless. God did not leave himself without testimony, and he would continue to give them rain in season, and he would continue to show them his goodness. Why does Paul call these gods worthless? You know what? If you go and study Greek gods and you really understand some of what these Greek gods would get up to, I think you can understand why you would call them worthless things. They had no morality. There was nothing good or worthwhile to follow. In fact, what made Christianity most effective was because of the moral ethic that it brought into society, the love, the kindness, and the fruit of the Spirit, and the different kind of way in which people lived is what made Christianity most effective in those generations and in the first 300 years. And the other gods, the gods of the nations, it becomes clearer and clearer that they are worthless when you put them in the same space as the one true living God, creator of heaven and earth. So this is what Paul then explains to them. So the crowd attempted to worship the apostles, and then the apostles rejected this worship, saying there's one true God. Now the irony here is that the fellow worshippers of this one true God come and they turn the crowd against them. So the Jewish people come and they manage to turn the crowd against them. And Paul gets stoned for blasphemy. Remember, it was a threat. They fled from that threat in Iconium. They get caught up. These guys catch up with them in Lystra, and Paul is stoned. Probably the justification, the Jewish justification, is that it's blasphemy, and maybe they might have said it's sorcery to the people of Lystra. Anyway, whichever way, he gets stoned and he's left for dead. Like what they did to Stephen, they did to Saul, or to Paul. They stoned him, left him for dead. The evil forces wanted to kill them. Just as they had done with Stephen, the evil forces were after killing Paul. First they were expelled, then they fled. Now one of them, Paul, is stoned to death and left for dead. But of course, we find that God allows him to rise. Left for dead, it seems like he wasn't dead. They thought he was dead, but he manages to get up. He must have been seriously wounded if they left him for dead. And they threw, and I explained to you before when I was talking about Stephen, that they would throw heavy stones onto the chest, and they would, follow that up with other stones. But they were not, when you're talking about being stoned to death, they were not just throwing little stones. They were throwing rocks and big stones, and they would be throwing them downwards. They would usually have you in a lower space, and they would throw these big stones on you and leave you for dead. Maybe he was even covered with stones by the time they left him. So that is what he would have gone through. And God allowed him to come out of that, and he was alive. And maybe for practical reasons, it says he re-entered the city, but then the next day left. Why did they re-enter the city? Maybe to make it known to the authorities, both human and spiritual, that he's alive, or maybe even for practical reasons. He couldn't go anywhere else. He wasn't strong enough. But it seems the next day he was strong enough to travel, and they left for Derby the next day. And we're going to talk about their time in Derby and then the return trip in the next session, because they spend some time in Derby and then they go back eventually they go back to Antioch as we finish chapter 14. So you are blessed, and we will continue with our series in the next session.